college football's most polarizing teams in 2021. Brad Crawford, who averages about an article every 15 minutes for 247sports.com, he put out an article, it's a couple of days old now, it's still on 247sports.com though, about the most polarizing teams in 2021. Now what he's talking about here is not you love them, I hate them, you love them, not that kind of polarization, although some of these brands do fit that description too. What he's talking about, and what we're going to talk about together here, is picking those teams where if you were to line up all the predictions from across the sphere of college football media and fandom, which ones have the widest discrepancy? I got someone ranked 8th. You got that same team unranked. We're looking for those kinds of teams. Well, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them here that Brad pointed out, and I got some thoughts on every one of them. So let's start with the Florida Gators. We got some Florida in the show tonight. This is just the beginning. How much do you value the way the 2020 season ended? Because that has a lot to do with, for better or for worse, how you're viewing Florida coming into 2021. Now, I've always been a believer that if you're going to reference any one point in a previous season, it should carry equal value to any other point. What I mean by that, for example, is if you want to look back at the Oklahoma bowl game that Florida played in, and you want to say, oh man, I hate Florida this year because of that. Well, I should just as easily be able to pick out the Georgia game from last year. What was it, 44-28? We were just talking about that, Colin. So my point is, I don't just believe in cherry picking from one point in a previous season, and I don't really go a whole lot off previous seasons in general because of how much roster and coaching staff turnover there averages out to be in college football. So every year is a new season, way more in college even than the NFL. But the polarization with Florida therein lies because not everyone thinks like that. Everyone's free to have their own opinion. A lot of people's lasting memory and their default setting for how they view Florida in 2021 is the last thing they saw them do. Well, the last thing they saw Florida do was just puttering, really just the entire team out back behind the station wagon, pushing it over the finish line. And they ran out of gas. And if that's how you feel, that's okay. I do want to say, and this is my opinion now, I think a lot of people have badly overcorrected for Florida. You may have been sky high on them at various points of last season, and now you get mad because maybe they prove some of your predictions wrong, and so then you take it personal on them in your preseason rankings the next year. It's reasonable to expect drop-off with Florida. I'm not saying it's not. But let's be real for just a second. If I were to do the blind resume situation here, and I told you, hey, I got a division winner from the Power 5 level. They've got 2 top 10 finishes over the past 4 years. And, oh, by the way, they've got top 10 to top 12 total talent roster composite per 247 Sports coming into this year. You're going to get them outside the top 25? That's really where you're going to rank them? No. Florida is one of the 25 best teams in America to enter the season. A lot of folks don't have them ranked there, and I'm telling you, it has a lot to do with the way they ended last season. So history has shown us that that is not the best way, that's not the best gauge to go about measuring teams, but the polarization is there with Florida. Now, up the road a little ways, what would we do? I guess we'd hop on I-95 maybe? I don't know. I'm going to North Carolina. That's where I'm going next. So North Carolina, Mack Brown, Mack Brown has a lot to do with this. There's a lot of love out there for North Carolina, and there should be. We've talked about the Tar Heels a fair amount on this show. So I love North Carolina this year. There are varying degrees of love. Of course, you rank them top 5. You love them a little more than I do. But the polarization is here. There are some people out there who are fully endorsing North Carolina this year that if you really nailed them down, could not tell you anything about North Carolina past Sam Howell, Mack Brown. They think that's all they need to know. Okay, now that's fine. You could end up still being right about him. You got him ranked in the top 10. They may validate every one of your preseason predictions. I don't necessarily know that it's because that entire crowd out there is intimately familiar with North Carolina from a position group by position group standpoint. But then there's the other side of the fence. Since we're talking polarization, there's another group that says, if you're from the South, you're familiar with the term in football, that team's a little bit too light in the britches. Well, that is exactly how you would encapsulate the North Carolina Tar Heels football team circa 2020. Really good offense, but they get put on skates when they face bigger, more physical teams like Notre Dame, for example, Clemson if you come up on them. And that's how you just blindly categorize North Carolina. And if I were to ask that crowd, well, what do you think about Jahvaree Ritzie? What do you think about Miles Murphy? What do you think about Keyshawn Silver? They would say, Whomst? You don't know those names. Now, granted, they're all young, and they're going to be counted on to play a lot of meaningful downs this year, but my point is North Carolina's defense is going to look a little bit different up front than they did last year, where at times they couldn't stop molasses in December. Doesn't automatically mean they're going to just close the door on the better offenses, more physical fronts that they face this year, but it gives them a better chance. So both sides of the polarized divide between North Carolina pros and cons this year, I think there's a little more research that needs to be done. In the Big Ten, no one was talking about Indiana this time last year. We were guilty of that also. Well, they'll be talking about them now. Context is very, very important when you're talking about Indiana. This is not a team that is going to start the season outside the top 25 and people are saying, hey, that's a sneaky non-ranked team that could end up inside the top 25 at the beginning of the year. That's not how people are painting Indiana. This is going to be a bona fide preseason top 15, easily top 20 team for pretty much everyone. So with that context in mind, yes, there's some polarization around this team because there is one group that's going to look at them and say, Indiana's not supposed to be in this conversation. And then that'll be it. There'll probably be a period right there on the end of that sentence. But if they want to go further, they'll say, well, 2020, COVID, that's kind of like saying, well, kids these days with social media, it's ambiguous on purpose. You don't really nail it down. Well, 2020 with COVID and they ambush teams and ... there's nothing else. And so you're just kind of, your devil's advocating for your own arguments there. Well, that could be the case, or it could be that they were just a really good team last year. If the latter is true, they get a vast majority of those players back. I can assure you, if they lose this year, it won't be because Tom Allen allowed his team to wilt under the pressure of expectation. Michael Penix is the big question mark, but see, they don't think he's a question mark in Indiana. I'm referring to the quarterback there. He got hurt. But at the same time, because it's Indiana, you don't get an update every single day on the program. It's not the most high-profile team in America. But if you get closer to the program, they, since the spring, have felt really good about Michael Penix. Tom Allen has made no bones about the fact that he believes he'll be full go by fall. So again, if Indiana falters, if they fail to live up to expectation this year, I don't think it's because of pressure. I don't think it'll be because of injury at the quarterback position unless something else happens. It may just be because they played some good football teams and got beaten. You see the schedule right here. They got to go to Iowa in week 1. They got a trip to Penn State. Of course, they got to play Ohio State. They got to go to Michigan, Minnesota. These, even when you rise to the level of a favorite, Indiana's never going to take a raw talent roster into games like this and be able to just throw the helmet out on the field and win. Most teams can't do that even when they do have a superior talent roster. But my point is, execution 12 weeks in a row is hard to achieve in college football. That is probably the biggest detraction that you could throw at Indiana right now. I just don't think they can execute at that high level. Well, I'd listen to that. But all the other stuff about pressure, I don't think it's going to be pressure that undoes that team, even if they are undone. Now we go down south to a team that everyone has an opinion on. Even if you live in Minnesota, even if you live in Washington State, you got an opinion on this team. And it is the Georgia Bulldogs. I think... Now, this is my feeling. You guys can correct me if you think I'm wrong. It is my opinion that the further you get from the South, the more reasonable and level-headed the opinions of Georgia football are. I think if you are an agnostic fan of the Georgia Bulldogs, so you don't care about them one way or the other, they're just another team to you. If you fit that description, chances are you look at Georgia and you say that's a really good program. They recruit at a very high level. They're better than 95% of the sport. They certainly haven't topped Alabama. They still have a ways to go to ultimately fulfill what they believe their destiny is, but I don't want to play them this Saturday. That's probably how most of the nation thinks about Georgia. Now, if you get down south, everyone is totally polarized. They either think that this is the year, #dogs on top, or they say overrated, all caps, 3 exclamation marks on the end. Now, to the overrated all caps crowd, I've always asked which teams is Georgia rated ahead of that they shouldn't be rated ahead of. And I always get into this kind of arbitrary argument of whataboutism, and I never really get told which teams those are. No one rates Georgia above Alabama. They really don't. If they know what they're doing, they don't. They don't rate them above Ohio State. They have not rated them above Clemson this year because Clemson's going to be favored in the game to start the year. My point is, the teams that Georgia is not better than, there aren't many of them, I don't normally see Georgia rated ahead of. However, here's what you could say if you wanted to play devil's advocate. Well, let me tell you something, JP. I'm going to go a little bit Southern drawl on it. Let me tell you something, JP. You know what Kirby Smart's managed to do? I'm over here now. You know what Kirby Smart's managed to do at least once every year he's been in Athens? Lose as a favorite. And I can't argue it, so what do? Well, I shrug. That's what I do. But they haven't had, I'm going to go back to the devil's advocate part A argument, they haven't had what they have this year, which puts a lot of pressure on you. Let's be real. If you walk around saying, well, when we get quarterback figured out, then we'll have everything figured out. Well, that's all well and good, but then the quarterback comes along, so there's no more excuse. You have melted the ice totally, and so it's time to either sink or swim, quite literally, regardless of what the roster holds for Georgia, regardless of how good they look. The bottom line in the minds of most, and I think this is perfectly reasonable at this point, is no opinion is going to change one way or the other on Georgia until they win a national championship. Because that's all they have left to accomplish. They've won the conference, they've gone to the playoff, they've won a playoff game, they've played for a national championship. It's a very unique situation. If you think about it, I want to say it was Chuck Oliver, who I appear on the show of quite often, but I think it was Chuck Oliver talking the other day about how there's no other program like this in America. Think about it. Any other big program, just insert in the blank. No one else has this situation where the fan base quite literally enters the season in championship or bust mode. I know some others think they are that way, but there are other things that you could accomplish at some other places. But at Georgia, everything else has been accomplished. Maybe you could say this about Ohio State. Maybe you could say it about Oklahoma. But, Oklahoma, a little bit different, man. Like Oklahoma, from a talent roster standpoint, both sides of the ball, they're only just now being viewed as getting there, getting on par with being able to compete. Georgia's been there. We run that special, we run that article, we did at the beginning of last year, the 24/7 Sports Team Talent Composite. Well, you know who was number one last year, and you know how it turned out. And it was the Stetson Bennett era. So I say all that to say a championship is the only thing that's going to change that polarization at this point. And the last one, we got to go about as far away from Athens, Georgia, and stay in the lower 48 as we can. We're going all the way to Washington. Washington is, I think, I say this a lot. Well, you can only say this about one team. They're one of the most interesting teams in America this year. We already talked about them in this context once. Washington was supposed to play for a Pac-12 championship last year. The COVID thing happened, so Oregon gets inserted. Oregon ends up winning the Pac-12 championship, and that's a big deal. Don't just gloss over that. You get to hang a banner for a game that in a normal year you wouldn't even been able to play in. Well, no one's apologizing at Oregon, at the point being. So as it relates to this year with Washington, what that has served to do is remove them from the national radar a little bit. I think the win total is 9 in a 12-game season, win total being 9. Now, 9's pretty high. If you know anything about the betting market for future totals, that's still pretty high. It's pretty good. That means a lot of it is expected of you. But what if I were to tell you that there is a possibility, a reasonable possibility, that this Washington team could be favored in every game? And if they're a dog, as it stands right now, if you were to simulate all these games right now, there's only one team that'd be a dog to, and that's Oregon. And since that game's at home, that thing would be like a field goal game. And so the reason I'm painting that as the backdrop is because a lot of folks are going to enter the season with Washington not even in the top 20. How often do you see a Power 5 team not rated top 15, much less top 20, that could be favored in every single game? At the very least, 11 out of 12 before injury has a chance to happen or anything like that could change everything. Well, that's Oregon, or that's Washington, rather. And the only explanation is the Pac-12 stench. That's it. If I park them in any other conference and they're favored in 11 out of 12 or even 12 out of 12 games, they're automatically in everyone's top 10. But because Jimmy Lake is still an unknown, quarterback situation is still kind of an unknown there, and the team overall, the program, as a result of the two things I just said, is still kind of an unknown, well, Washington is an unknown. And that one's, I know a couple of people have already said this, but I'll echo the sentiment. That's one of the most intriguing teams in the country this year because they are going to be favored. There's going to be one perception of them. But there's also going to be a whole lot of games, and you were looking at the schedule just a second ago. Just because I say they're going to be favored every game, even if they were, it doesn't mean favored by 3 touchdowns every game. It's going to be favored by 7, favored by 5, favored by 8, so a bunch of losable games still. So Washington's one to keep an eye on. But who did we have? We had Florida, North Carolina, Indiana, Georgia, Washington. Those are some polarizing teams, Mr. Crawford. I will have to agree with that.